All right, I'm going to hand over to you, and you are seminar room J1, so you're perfectly visible.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Louis. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Penny King, Professor Penny King. I'm sure actually Penny doesn't need an introduction. She's one of ours, and so we all know her very well. A little bit of a biography. So Penny finished her PhD at Arizona State Uni in 1999, and then had a brief postdoc there before she moved on to Western Uni in Canada, followed by the Uni of New Mexico, and she landed here in RSES, I think about 10 years ago, if that's about the right timing, with a faculty position. During that time, she's held an ARC Future Fellowship from 2014 to 2018, and currently she's the head of the shrimp group across there in J5 in the geochemistry research area. Penny's accumulated a number of awards during her career, notably the Joanne Simpson Medal for Mid-Career Scientists in Earth and Space Science. That's a AGU award in 2019. She's a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK in 2017, and a Fellow of the AGU in 2019, and a Fellow of the Mineralogical Society of America in 2019. Another achievement or set of achievements that Penny's notable for has been in the equity and diversity space, where she's been a passionate advocate for improving equity and diversity in academia generally at ANU and in this research school. She's achieved a tremendous amount in that space through her energy and drive, and the school particularly is a much better place because of all of those efforts. And as a result of that, she was awarded the Claire Burton Award for Equity and Diversity, which is one of the ANU Vice Chancellor Staff Excellence and Service Awards. That was about 3 years ago, I think. In terms of research, Penny's interested primarily in high temperature gas-solid reactions or gas-mineral reactions on planetary surfaces, and she's applied this to a whole range of different areas, including problems around the emergence of life on Earth, carbon sequestration, volatile behaviour in magnetic systems, volcanism, evolution of atmospheres, industrial applications, and others as well. And so very diverse applications for her research. And today, she's going to tell us about the linked evolution of planetary surfaces and atmospheres. So thanks, Penny.
Thanks, Greg. That was lovely. I said that, but I don't know if you heard that as we passed. It's great to see so many of you here today. Thank you for coming, and also to those of you online. Please do pop into the chat if I become hard to hear online. We're still figuring out the logistics of this kind of dual mode presentation. So today, as Greg mentioned, I'm going to talk about the linked evolution of planetary surfaces and atmospheres. But I'd be remiss not to, first of all, introduce you to this wonderful group of colleagues on the screen here who have worked on these topics. And I realised I've actually only shown my younger colleagues, and it's not ageism on purpose, but it's because I didn't really have the photos on my phone of those other people, and I should have put up some other people around the school and elsewhere who I also work with. But this is my close group. Okay, so today I'm going to take you on what I'm going to call a thought exercise in a way. I'm going to take you through how I've been trying to think about the links between surfaces of planets and their atmospheres. And this is a paper I've been trying to write now for 3 years. And I've really been struggling. And so I said, you know what, I'm just going to give a talk on it and see what people say. So that's what today is a talk on this, and let's see what you say. And maybe I'll get that paper written, hopefully very soon. How does this work? No, all kinds of buttons, but none of them working. Here we go. Something worked. Thanks, Spoon. Okay, so unfortunately we have a screen issue in the room, but hopefully you can read onto the black. This says humans love to explore, and I've got some examples of exploring the Pacific in catamarans and Aboriginal songlines across Australia. We also love to explore our skies. And so we have a long history as humans exploring the skies from Egypt, from China, and 21st century exploration looks a bit like this. It also looks like looking at the bottom of the oceans, looking at Antarctica, and looking at our high atmospheres. It looks like a lot of things, but what I will talk to you about today is exploration of our solar system. One of the reasons that we explore our solar system is to try and answer our place in that set of planetary bodies. And so here I'm showing a whole lot of bodies that are of high interest to many space agencies across the world. And you might know that the current big thing that's going on in at least the American system is the goal to send a female to Mars, to the moon, and then the idea is to go from the moon to Mars. So this is where NASA is going right now. So one of the reasons that I find looking beyond interesting is to really try and understand better why Earth is blue and why we have this blue, green, and white planet is rather puzzling compared to the other bodies that we look around in our solar system. Now, water has long been known as one of the important ingredients. And so in Australia, our Indigenous people have recognised water spirits. And here are some beautiful pictures from Western Australia of the Wandjina cloud and rain spirits that created the landscape, its inhabitants, and helped seed life. NASA also has this same premise that water is important for life. And in fact, many of the NASA missions over the last number of decades have involved the search for water, or the water spirit, in searching for life beyond Earth. And so for many years, there was a program that was called Follow the Water, and you can see a report from that program here. In addition to searching for water, in searching for life elsewhere and our place in the solar system, the main sign of life that we anticipate seeing is microbial life. So here in this picture, I'm showing microbes on the left and stromatolites that you'd all be well aware of in Hamlin Bay in Western Australia. And then at the bottom, we have Vicky Bennett and Alan Nutman, who have found some of the oldest evidence for life in these stromatolites from Western Greenland. So let's fix this. Oh dear, you touch one thing here and you mess up other things. There we go. So searching for life in the solar system, in addition to looking for water and microbes, we also tend to look for old rocks. And that's because the old rocks are when life arose, and the feeling goes, or the hypothesis goes, that that's a good thing to then look for elsewhere are old rocks. On Earth, the earliest signs of life are hard to come by, as we've heard excellent talks over this seminar semester. Thank you, seminar organisers, on this, around the difficulty of interrogating Archean rocks. Mars, though, has a much larger extent of very, very old rocks. And so in orange, we have rocks that are actually older than 3.7 billion years. So there's a lot of places that you can go on Mars to look for these old signs of early life, if it does indeed exist there. So water would be the other thing that we'd then want to look for in looking for life. On Earth, as you know, there's water has specific features that you can see from the aeroplane or from a satellite. So on the left, I've shown some rivers, and we see very similar features on Mars that have been interpreted to indicate past water. But if we go and look at Mars now, we don't see water. So you might then be saying, well, why would we go there? It's dry, it's cold. It ranges from about -120 degrees to +25. It has a very, very thin atmosphere, 0.7% of the Earth's atmosphere, that's CO2 rich, no oxygen. It's not well shielded from radiation. DNA would break down. And so life, if any, would probably have to be limited, hiding out in a refuge, and a kind of life that maybe we wouldn't even recognize. So why would we look there? Well, Mars has a strange water history compared to Earth. And why we would look there is because the history of water on Mars is actually backwards from Earth. So on Earth, we have a general sequence of, we think maybe it started off dry, degassing occurred, we formed an atmosphere, there were a whole lot of impact events, maybe blew away that initial atmosphere, we formed another atmosphere, and we have an atmosphere and an ocean that have developed over time. Mars, though, is the opposite. Early in Mars's history is when we see that evidence of these gullies and surface water features. And so we think that on Mars, it started off wet and then became dry. And so that then gives people hope that Mars might be a good place to go and look for early life, because it had those ingredients of water, old crust, at the same time that life was developing on Earth. And so it's sort of interesting logic, isn't it? We're going a place that's completely backwards, but we're going back in time to look for the beginnings of something that happened on Earth, and we're using Mars as an analogue for the early stages of our planet. Okay, so what is Mars like today, and what might we do to try and find those kinds of clues? Well, Mars, as you know, is the red dot in the sky, and it's a very dry place, as I mentioned before, and so it has abundant dust. These northern plains are largely dusty, has the largest volcanoes in the solar system. This gouge here is Big Canyon. These dark areas are dark sands. And then this is a large impact crater here. And a lot of these areas up here are impacted. We've visited quite a number of places that are labelled here on the diagram, and you can see the latest landing of Perseverance rover is up here near the edges of the northern plains. If we go in close with a rover, we learn quite a bit more, and we learn a little bit more about the geology. And so what we find is that the material is mostly basaltic. So like the lavas in Hawaii. There are also, in addition to basaltic materials, there are lots of secondary materials, and that's the phrase I'm going to use today. So those secondary materials, I'm going to use that phrase to refer to clays, sulfates, salt minerals like halides, so sodium chloride on your table at home, oxides, and sometimes rare carbonates. So I mentioned earlier, the surface is dusty. Here you can see the grain size of some of the materials. It's very fine. There are veins of calcium sulfate, which I will talk a lot about in this talk today. So there are two kinds, anhydrite without water, and meaning none, I guess, in this case, and gypsum with water. And then there are iron sulfates as well. So searching for water can involve searching for these secondary minerals. So secondary minerals commonly contain water, and we can do that with a variety of techniques. This is using epithermal neutron methods, and the map shows water equivalent hydrogen. So the most purple is the poles where there's water ice. I don't know why in the Mars literature they always refer to it as water ice. I think it's because there's also ammonia ice and other things that you could have as ice. There's a lot of hydrogen in the sulfate, gypsum, that I just talked about. And then in these central areas, there's hydrogen in minerals, and then there's also hydrogen in the ice at the poles. We can also search for the hidden water using infrared spectroscopy. And many of you know that I have a lab upstairs that we work in to look at infrared spectra of minerals. The clay minerals have been detected on Mars in a variety of places, shown here in these blue outlines. And we also have other secondary minerals, sulfates, found associated with those clay minerals. And both of these tend to be in some of the oldest areas. Again, consistent with that data that I showed you earlier of the gullies on Mars, that there was water on the surface of Mars early in its history. And so what all of these lines of evidence have been used to produce is a history of the surface of Mars. And so this is the current history that would be well accepted in the community, that early in Mars's history, a lot of clays were produced. So those are minerals with water in them. So a lot of water was trapped in the clays, followed by sulfates. A lot of sulfur was trapped in those secondary minerals, followed by ferric oxides. So this is all rather peculiar, isn't it? It's completely backwards of Earth. We have a drying history, or a history of less water with time. What else is going on? Well, it turns out that early in Mars history, we also have a lot of evidence for volcanism and a lot of evidence for impact. And so those are two potential ways that we could be supplying or remobilizing water on the surface of Mars. After that time, we have less evidence for those major events, and we have more sort of little valley networks, some big channels of, they're called major outflow channels because they're quite big, and then little snips of episodic movement of water on the surface of Mars. And so the prevailing story is that we start off with a surface of Mars that's wet, and so the atmosphere is also wet. We go to acidic, and that's related to the sulfates, and I'll come back to that later. And then we go to dry. So this is the current suggestion. So I was thinking about this. So what are actually the processes that would be contributing to what's going on the surface of Mars? Now, unlike Earth, Mars doesn't have plate tectonics. So that's actually quite good. You can just take plate tectonics out, makes it a lot simpler. All we have to worry about are some volcanoes, so magmatic events, bringing heat to the surface, so potentially setting up hydrothermal and metamorphic systems as well. We have sedimentary processes at the surface, wind, water, ice, and diagenesis. We have photochemistry, because remember, we have a very thin atmosphere. We have impacts, and then we also have loss of gas to space. So all of these things are then going to potentially tell us something about how we're drying that planet. So from about 2004, there's been a really large emphasis, in fact, even from the 1970s, there's been a big emphasis on the blue part of this diagram. the aqueous and ice processes. And look, King et al. Got onto that story as well. But so I've published a bunch of papers talking about aqueous processes on Mars. But I've had these niggly feelings for a number of years because there's just some things that don't add up. One of them is the need for acidity. And that comes about because there aren't very many carbonates on Mars. So people say, oh, they must have all reacted with acid and gone away. They've all gone into the CO2s in the atmosphere. There's also some problems of, well, you can kind of like pull some answers out of the air saying, oh, well, we had water at this time, but we didn't at that time. And it's episodic. And so I'm actually never satisfied with episodic. It just feels like it's cheating. There's also some other strange things like abundant dry sulfates at the equator, but wet ones, gypsum, at the poles. So there's been, and you know, I could go on, but I won't. There's a few sort of niggly things. So King began doubting herself and thinking maybe King was wrong. So I decided I should look further into the other processes and see if these other processes could also have a role in drying the surface of Mars. So because I like chemistry, I thought, let's start with phases. Okay, what are the phases involved? When we're talking about the aqueous processes that I've been spending my life thinking about, liquids and solids, are the phases present. And the liquids would be aqueous solutions, so waters. In contrast, if we're talking about volcanoes, then the phases are going to be melts, solids, and gases. And if we're talking about impacts, it would be the same three things. So I started thinking, maybe we need to look elsewhere. Is there a role for high temperature reactions, just high temperature because they're faster and because we have high temperatures in both of those processes, is there a role for those kinds of reactions in changing the surface of the planet? So the kinds of reactions are reactions where gas condenses to a solid or gas reacts with another solid to make new solids and new gases. So where do you find that on Earth? Well, volcanoes are the best place to go, plus they're fun. So at volcanoes, we know that we have degassing over long periods of time, tens of thousands of years, contributing to reactions between gases and solids. We also know that we have explosive eruptions with gases. And here I'm showing Kilauea in 2018. Megan and I both went, it was so cool. Not at the same time, but so you can see though, there's just amazing materials in the atmosphere above the volcano. In these scenarios, what we have is a really corrosive and toxic gas with sulfur, halogens, and nasty things in it. Don't try and do this in your lab. It sucks. The WHS is something to be believed. Anyway, in these systems, sulfur dominates, and it dominates as sulfur dioxide on all planets except for the Moon and Mercury, which I'll come to later in the talk. Okay, so we went to Kilauea and we tried to sample things to look for evidence of these reactions between gases and solids. So this was a master's project by Emily Oborski. Many of you will know Emily, who did a lovely job on this project. What she did was she took ashes from all of these eruptions on the right here and then undertook an analysis of what the products were. And she was then able to group them into different settings within the volcanic system. And hopefully you can see that there is a core of glass surrounded by minerals. That's actually a reaction. And same here. There are reaction rims around these materials that are captured in the volcanic products. And so she found evidence of reactions in the hydrothermal system, reactions occurring at the lava lake, and also reactions occurring in the plume. And so hopefully, I think this one's really quite lovely. You see glass surrounded by albite, which is a sodium feldspar, surrounded by calcium sulfate. And so these reactions are producing sulfates because the eruption has some of the highest sulfur dioxide of any volcano that has erupted where we've been measuring the sulfur dioxide. Okay, so Emily found these products and we thought, okay, we've made these observations. Can we actually model those reactions? Because eventually what we'd like to do is say, okay, if that happened on Mars, could we model that? And so one of the good things about the Earth is you can have your samples and use those as ground truth to models that you then might want to apply elsewhere. And so the observations were that there were materials from these eruptions consistently a little more than half basalt. And so the basalt here is all the stuff in black and blues. And that we consistently had a range of alteration materials, including the sulfates that I keep mentioning. So we then went about trying to model this with a Gibbs free energy minimization model. That's so boring. I'm not going to go through that. But basically we just took starting materials and products and tried to model them to figure out where they might form. And what I want you to take home is that we made sulfates and oxides. We didn't actually go low enough temperature to start making clays, but we could have done that. No, actually we didn't put clays in a model, but we could have done that. So what we found was that the sulfates are produced at really pretty high temperatures, consistent with some other work that Chris Rengley had done. So one of the things that this study helped us with was finding an analogue on Earth for making sulfates and oxides. Remember, they were part of that whole climate story. So finding them here in analogue rocks on Earth and then being able to successfully model them can then be used to then apply back to Mars to those to that climate sequence. Am I making sense? Okay. Whoops. Okay, so Earth's analogues are really helpful because they can provide constraints and checks on the models that we might then take and apply elsewhere. But the problem with Earth, particularly with Hawaii, is it's hard to avoid water. It's really humid in Hawaii and it's really quite wet on the planet. And so oftentimes what you might find on Earth may not be the same as Mars where it's bone dry, because things like salts can dissolve very easily. And so what we thought we should do is do some other checks by doing some experiments.
Maybe.
Yeah.
If you could do it, and that's being planned, you go to Venus, of choice, right now.
Yeah, it's just a bit too hot for the instruments to work very well. That's
Well,
the
the
problem.
Russians did it.
The Russians did do it, but they didn't last very long. But we are going, yes, NASA's going to Venus, and I'll talk about Venus right at the end. Yeah.
I mean, as a dry but CO2 sulfur bearing atmosphere, that's your choice.
Yeah, we're going to get to Venus at the end of the talk. I'm glad you're going into that space.
Oh,
Yeah, you won't be there, but I'm glad you're thinking in that space. I don't think I'd want to go to any other planet. I quite like Earth. Okay, so we did some experiments. We've done 2 different kinds. I mentioned earlier the gas-solid reactions could be gas to solid. So the way that you can make gases turn into solids is you cool them down. Okay, so we've done that in sealed silica glass tubes. That's what this picture is at the top here. There's a hot area of the tube. This is temperature. So this end of the tube's at 1200 degrees. This end of the tube's below 200. Sorry, that's 250 degrees. Millimeters, it's below 0. So that's out in the room. And so there's a temperature gradient in this tube. And if you start with a basalt that's got sulfur and chlorine and things, ingredients in it, you can make a gas phase that then will precipitate as it goes to cooler temperatures. And so this is what Hannah Neckvissel and her student Nick DiFrancesco worked on in their lab at Stony Brook to make a whole lot of iron oxides. Remember, oxides, one of the things we're looking for. They didn't make sulfates, but they made sulfur, and they made a whole lot of salt minerals too. So that's part of the story that we saw on Mars, the oxides, but we're not getting the sulfates or the clays with this. So we've been doing some other experiments, and those were done here, down in the Florey building, where we took solids and reacted with them with gas, instead of just doing that condensation. And so we have gas flow through this furnace and can put materials in it and react them at consistent temperatures. When you do that, strange things happen. So this is these are two pyroxene minerals. So they're common in basalts and common on the surface of Mars. And we put them in the furnace for 24 hours at 600 degrees and made a whole lot of the sulfates and also oxides by this reaction. So that made us really start thinking, wow, I wonder if we're making these phases through these high temperature gas solid reaction processes rather than, or in addition to, aqueous processes. Okay, so then we did our modelling again, because we have to do that so that we can apply it to Mars. So here's some modelling. The way that this is showing amount versus temperature. We're starting off with the blue line, which is our pyroxene, and what we're making are sulfates. So here's calcium sulfate being made. The star is where you start making more sulfate than our starting material, pyroxene. And you can play games making different kinds of reaction products, and you can also look at the gases, which is kind of interesting. So if you then start looking at the gas reaction products, you can start linking what might be going on in the atmosphere with these kinds of reactions that are between a gas, a solid, producing a new gas and a new bunch of solids and gases. So Chris Rengley did this kind of work and published it 2 years ago, applying these kinds of models to Mars, Venus, and the Earth. And so on this diagram, he's showing oxidation state, so it's more oxidized at the top of the diagram, and also the amount of sulfur dioxide. And he's showing in these diagrams here at the top that you can make iron oxides, so hematite and magnetite, very easily through these processes of those kinds of reactions on these planets, whereas on the Moon and Mercury, more reduced, you tend to make metallic materials instead. And we make sulfates on Mars, Venus, and the Earth, whereas we don't make those sulfate minerals on Mercury and the Moon. So at this point, we thought, okay, we've spent a lot of time playing in the sulfur and looking at sulfates and looking at oxides, but we actually need to understand clays, because the whole climate history that I'm taking you through in clay sulfate oxide. So we've shown you can look at sulfates and oxides, and they seem to be reacting and forming at high temperatures, which is a surprise, but and adds to our ways to make materials on the surface of Mars. But actually, we really need to know about water, and we really need to know about CO2. Okay, so really complicated models by Tim. So Tim finished his honours thesis earlier this year, and he did a whole modelling story with absolutely everything included. And so you're not supposed to look at these diagrams, just be impressed at the complexity of Tim's diagrams. They took a lot of checking and so forth, which he did really well. So what were his findings? His findings from these models were that and what he chose to do was to say, okay, I have my volcano, how much gas am I pumping through it? Am I pumping through an equal amount of gas as rock, or am I pumping through a lot more gas than rock? So he looked at a range of those scenarios. What he found was if you pump through more gas, you get more clay. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? You've got more water, you're going to make more clay and alter things more. Less intuitive was that he found that oxides are consistently abundant, and it doesn't really matter how much gas you pump through your system, you always get lots of oxides. And also less intuitive was that you can make lots of calcium sulfate, and it doesn't really change much as a function of how much gas you have there either. What he found that was really significant, though, was that CO2 doesn't react. CO2 stays as the gas, and only the water and the sulfur dioxide or other sulfur species are consumed. So what does that mean? Well, if that was all too much squiggly lines on graphs, we're back to the simpler pictures again now. And what that means is that through these processes of gas-solid reactions, we effectively are scrubbing the gas. So scrubbing is used in industrial processes to clean up gas. What's happening in this case is we're using basalt. We're starting with a complex magmatic gas, reacting it with the basalt, making new secondary products, and those secondary products are taking up the water and the sulfate and leaving behind the CO2 that is then building the atmosphere. And so I suspect that that's what's happened on Mars, and you were asking about Venus. I suspect that's happened on Venus as well, with some other caveats. Okay, so water and carbonate form at the lowest temperatures. And carbonate only forms when there's lots of water around, because CO2 actually doesn't like to react very much. So I did mention that there's rare carbonates on Mars, and they're rare because they only form in places where it's really, really wet. But on Mars, otherwise, the CO2 is not reacting and is going into the gas, building up the CO2-rich atmosphere. The sulfates are forming at moderate to high temperatures, and they don't necessarily have to form in these aqueous solutions that I had spent all this time modelling when I was earlier in my career. Okay, so I mentioned that we needed to look at the processes again, and that some of the high temperature gas solid reactions are occurring in volcanoes, but we also have them occurring during impact. So I'm going to move now to impact, because they're really important on other planets like Mars, and you've seen the craters on the Moon, Mercury. And so impacts are a process that can also result in reasonably high temperatures. Here on the right is a diagram of a transient impact crater, and vaporization and melting occurs in this central portion of the crater, and material is then ejected, and as it is ejected, it cools through both expansion and radiation. So we wanted to model this again, but you know, the thermodynamic models don't do 20 gigapascals very well. So we just decided to model it as a temperature trajectory, and I'll show you why that's valid. Okay, so this is a diagram of pressure versus temperature, and it's the results of some shock experiments. So this red line, on the left-hand side of the red line, anhydrite, our friendly calcium sulfate that's all over the surface of Mars, is stable. On the right-hand side of the line, it's not stable anymore. It's broken down and it's formed sulfur dioxide gas. If the anhydrite is porous, so like it would be in the regolith that I showed you earlier, so little grains, then the pressure is lower at a given temperature for calcium sulfate to go into the gas. This is what an impact event might look like. Here's a rock making its way to Earth, Martian meteorite. We've got, I don't know, it's more than 60. If Addy was here, he could tell me Martian meteorites. Maybe Yan Kun knows. No, okay. We have almost, between 60 and 100 Martian meteorites. And they're the ones that made it here. There's a bunch of stuff that got vaporized on the surface of the planet and didn't make it there and got recycled on the surface. So what Tim did was he plotted up the pressures and temperatures of the shock of Martian meteorites. And you can see where this is going. It's going to cross that line. In fact, there's two that have crossed the line. And so if you're impacting into the regolith on the surface, all of that porous stuff, it's actually going to be fairly easy to turn those materials on the surface into gases at high temperatures. So what we decided to do was just model what if you took the average soil on the surface of Mars and took it up to high temperature and brought it back down? What would you get? So again, Tim did his complicated models, and we did this with a twist. Mars has ice. Remember I showed you that hidden ice earlier today? So there's that hidden water. And in fact, there's probably ice hidden across a lot of the planet. What that means is that you can actually add a lot of water to material that you impacted. So that's what Tim did. He went and said, okay, I'm going to add 35% water to my material to simulate impact into ice. When he did that, he found that if he has trace water, he makes some clays at this temperature, but when he adds 35% water, he makes lots of clays. That's sort of a no-brainer, right? The oxides were about the same, and his sulfates were slightly more hydrated. That makes sense. So he's actually proven this observation of more gypsum near the poles where there's more ice. So more of the hydrated calcium sulfate is near where there's ice. More of the anhydrous without water calcium sulfate is near the equator. And so that's kind of cool. So Mars is going to behave a little differently than other planets because it has ice. Earth, as you know, ice is only at the poles. Mars, a lot of ice. Venus, we'll come to. Whoops. Okay, so to kind of summarize what I think might be going on or have happened on Mars is during that heavy bombardment period, when we also had a lot of volcanism, we had repeated impacts that remobilized material, homogenized the material, made the global dust almost consistent composition. It amorphized a lot of the material on the surface of Mars. Our XRD analyses of Martian sediments show up to 30% amorphous material. So that's pulverized, I'm sure. That process of impacting then took the gas that was around, the gas that was produced through these kinds of impact into these hydrous materials, and made clouds of gas and dust that reacted. If there was ice, there was even more water in that dust cloud, and it's recycled that material and kind of gardened it and moved it around. The early atmosphere would have retained the carbon dioxide because the water was taken up in the clay minerals or in ice. And also because the reaction rates for carbonation are really slow if there's no water around. So that then brings us back to this diagram that I showed towards the beginning, which talks about the history of drying on the surface of Mars. And so my hypothesis would be that actually what we're seeing is a change in the processes and a change in the amount of high temperature gas solid reactions. Early in Mars's history, when we have the heavy bombardment and the volcanism, we have a lot of the mineral fluid reactions going on, sequestering material in clays. As we continue, we have less and less of that, and the sedimentary processes take over. Sure, we could still have some remobilization and movement of water on the surface, but I don't think that's what's the basic control on this variation that we see over time. Okay, so while I was thinking about this, as I mentioned, for 3 years or whatever, in the meantime, a paper came out, don't you love that, that talks about a new driver for water loss on Mars. And it actually has some of the ideas that I've presented today, and which is good. And these authors were looking at trying to also explain the very strange high deuterium to hydrogen ratio that we've encountered on the surface of Mars. Their story is a little different than what I just presented. This group suggests that water from volcanism is trapped in clay minerals in the crust, and then that occurs early in the history, and then the freezing of that material later is the that's the major later process. So they've actually missed the impact part of the story that I think is also going on, but this is really consistent with the model that I just presented. So the next question would be, in 3 minutes, can we apply this to other bodies? So we have this model where we have not only sedimentary hydrologic processes, we also have these high temperature gas solid reactions and potentially loss of gas to space. We have recycling on the surface. So what we can do is look at, well, then what are the differences between these planets, and what could we do with that? So one of the major differences between the inner planets and some of the moons and asteroids that we have information on is their size. So here I've got a plot of diameter relative to Earth versus duration of volcanism. So bigger, more volcanoes, and also bigger, it's easier for a planet to grab onto its atmosphere and hold it. So I would then argue bigger equals better equals more gas solid reactions, because I really like them. Heliocentric distance is also a major control. Why do I say that? Well, as you move away from the sun, here's out of the sun, as you move away, there's dissipation of the energy. It's that radius from the sun. And so the amount of ice increases with distance from the sun. So Mars, as I mentioned earlier, lots of ice. Earth, just at the poles. Venus, I don't think you're going to find any ice even on a cold day. There was ice in my dog bowl this morning. Not my dog bowl, the dog's dog bowl. Just as a random thought. Okay, so we can think about those two things then, size and heliocentric distance, whether it's got ice, that can be a source of gases for reactions. And I did that, like, this is my back of the envelope. You could do this at a restaurant kind of idea. Probability of gas-solid reactions versus diameter. And I think I just said it gets higher as you get bigger, because you have more like, oh, have I missed a slide? I've missed a slide. Okay, so my ideas here were bigger, more volcanism, more likelihood of impact because there's more body to impact into, and it has a longer cooling heat flow history, and so there's more, the volcanism's longer, and there's also an effect of heliocentric distance. If it's got more ice, there's more likelihood to get gas when you impact. So I've used all of those things to come up with a rough probability for those kinds of reactions at the surface of these different bodies. And you can see it sort of generally gets higher as we get bigger. There's a difference between present day and previous. For example, for Mars, we think it had lots of water early, and that's when it had the bombardment and volcanism. When that shut down, the probability went down. So just look at the blue bits of this diagram. What I've done is tried to come up with a rough inventory of where the water is on different planets. Now, Riley's doing this properly, but I'm doing this improperly here. Look at the blue areas. Earth has water in the gas phase, the liquid phase, in ice, and also in minerals. Mars has it in the gas phase and very little. Ice phase and mineral phase. Venus, well, it doesn't have any liquid, doesn't have any ice. We don't know about the minerals, but it definitely has it in the gas phase. So with this kind of diagram, we can also look at the potential for different planets to either retain or lose their water using the range of different volatile species. Of course, this is assuming things like plate tectonics and life don't exist. So it's a little bit of a back of the envelope thought exercise. But I think it is potentially a useful way of thinking about whether or not we'd have these kinds of reactions. So to summarize, I've presented a story where we have solids and gases reacting due to either impact or volcanism at high temperatures, making new materials. And that has then changed the gas composition. On Mars and Venus, we probably keep the products. On Earth, because we have so much water, we probably dissolve some of those products. So this is going to be very hard to track down on Earth, because we might have dissolved all our sulfates out to make the sulfate oceans that Jochen likes. So what's next? Well, as I mentioned, Riley's looking at volatile inventories, and we have a range of other projects going on. And just looking at the time, I think I'll stop right there with a slideshow. Well, you can read about those people, and then I have a slideshow that can play during the questions. So thank you. You want to ask about Venus, don't you?
No, since you invite me, I had a different point to make, which was to have any significant effect on either the solid or the gas. You want lots of reactions to take place, not just a thin veneer on a surface.
Yeah.
So you need a gardening process, which I think you're right.
The impact does that. Yep.
Or you want a surface replenishment like new lavas and ashes.
Yep.
And sustain them. And what you don't have on somewhere like Mars, perhaps, is renewed topography where you, through volcanoes, during new topography, which will erode and shed clays into a basin or do those kind of reactions. So it's like a gardening of the surface is really an important process to do something mass balance-wise significant to either your atmosphere or the majority of the planet.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how surface it really is, because I started looking at, I showed you the pictures of pyroxenes and pyroxene reactions. What we would predict is that the pyroxenes on Mars should lose their calcium. So I then went and looked at, okay, pyroxenes from lersiolites, pyroxenes from basaltic rocks, shergottites and martlites, and then pyroxenes from breccias that we think are from the surface. And then finally, pyroxenes from the Curiosity rover. Prediction was actually sort of, it looks like there's a whole lot of range in the basalt, so it's a bit hard to tell, but certainly the Curiosity rover pyroxenes are much lower in calcium than the deeper crust ones. So I'm not sure how deep that gardening goes, but, and I didn't show that plot because I'm just not sure whether I actually believe it.
We're short of the drill hole now. You won't.
No.
You'll focus your attention on the effect. So there you go. This is an effect.
Yep.
But what you don't know is how pervasive,
How deep it goes. But if it's hitting lersiolites, I mean, so when you impact and send the sample to Earth, you are,
yes,
it's essentially a drill hole.
yes.
So I think that's one line of evidence, but the problem is that the basalts have such variable pyroxene compositions that it gets sort of blurry. But if you just looked at the end members, you'd go, oh yeah. Yeah. Charlie.
Yeah, in the beginning of your talk, you had some epochs. One was like the clay epoch, and then you had the sulfate epoch, and then you had iron oxide epoch. Now, for example, the sulfate epoch, what turned on the sulfate epoch and what turned it off? Because you had it from a certain, like, I don't know, 3.8 to about 2.5 billion years. What turned it on at 3.8? What turned it off at 2.5?
I think what turned it on at 3.8 was you ran out of water. You trapped all your water in clays and ice. And so then it was the next most reactive thing to be cycled out.
So it was not being reacted.
So I think it's all
before.
about, it was being reacted before, but it was getting released and cycled through. So what we really need are reaction rates.
And what turned it off at 2.5?
So that we could then go, okay, the reaction rate here is XYZ to make these clays. The reaction rate for sulfates is XYZ. And then you could actually model that turning on and off. The other way you could do this is look at Martian meteorites at different ages and try and see their sulfate
What you say?
abundance and content and what's going on with their isotopes.
But you say,
So that's what Addie's going to do.
you say that it turned on at 3.8 because of loss of water. What happened at 2.5?
It didn't really turn on.
I know, but we're just speaking generally, like your diagram.
Yeah. Actually, I just stopped my share by mistake. Yeah, please go. I'm sorry I went a bit late there. I think it just, there wasn't impact going on and there wasn't volcanism going on too. Right, so early on, there's lots of, you're going through this. So 3.7 to 3.9, about then is the end of the heavy bombardment. So that's when you're turning off the water thing. So the water cycle's turning off at that point. You're trapping everything into the clays and ice then. And so then the next thing is sulfates moving around.
And what starts with ferric then?
Ferric's just going all the time. I just don't think it's really true that it's a thing. And I think that the modelling shows ferric's going all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
In your first slide, you show all those veins of sulfate and stuff, and
those were images taken by the rovers in sedimentary basins.
Correct.
You were telling us that those things form in volcanoes and evaporators.
Yep.
But like we showed us is sedimentary.
Yep.
Happy evaporators.
Yeah, so there's definitely sedimentary processes that go on as well. Now those veins, you can also make veins through moving gas through a rock. So you impact, you have a shock wave, you have the material cross that line into unstable, crossing the anhydrite stability line, and then you have gases leaving. And as they leave, they're reacting with the rock, making sulfate veins is one hypothesis
And
there.
do we have evaporators or volcanoes next to the landing sites?
We do, and like they're in craters as well. So I think it's a bit hard to prove that hypothesis. You can say, yes, it could happen. Figuring out how to prove it is something I haven't figured out. What we initially thought we would do was look for volume change, because volume change is quite large, making anhydrite or gypsum, but we just couldn't see any evidence that you'd find convincing when we tried to do that. So another way you could look at it is, do you have more anhydrite than gypsum? Because you might say, okay, if it really is the high temperature process, I'd expect it to be anhydrite all the time and gypsum secondary, or gypsum's lower temperature. So I think you could potentially play some games of what's your gypsum anhydrite abundance. And what Tim found when he went through the literature was different sections in Gale Crater, which is a crater, that were anhydrite versus anhydrite plus gypsum plus basanite, which is another form of calcium sulfate. And so there were different sequences with different collections of those minerals. So that's another thing that potentially would be worth looking at. But good question.
Some people may have to go. It's
Yeah.
a good idea to allow those people to filter out. There are some more questions in the chat,
Yeah.
which you can address. Otherwise, we can sort of move into more informal part of the chat. Many people who are online, put stuff up in the chat if you like any time.
So I don't know if Leo's still there. I think I mentioned some of the potential measurements that we could do. We could also do some isotope work on Martian materials. Have we drilled? No, but we've got meteorites. Yeah, the hydrogen escape is definitely the scenario that's been favoured on Mars, Frank. And yeah, that whole photochemical stuff that goes on and oxygen reacting with the surface. So this does not require that. Yeah. So we actually I don't know that we need to require hydrogen escape with this scenario. I don't know if that's answering. It could accommodate it, but I mean, the high DH on Mars can also be due to local hydrogen loss rather than full-scale water loss. So local mineral losing its hydrogen, low hydrogen fugacity rather than low water fugacity.
Okay, Penny, why don't we formally let yours look?
Okay.
And anybody who's in the building, there seems to be coffee. You can come and down and have a chat to Penny over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And for everyone else who joined us online, thank you very much. And feel free to email.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And Laura, yes, we are modelling manganese oxides and we're doing it aqueously, but I feel kind of guilty doing that when I don't really think aqueous is so important.
Even subsurface.
Yeah, we can have films of water subsurface. Yeah.
But you think it doesn't